The cold was the first thing that registered, a deep, bone-aching chill that seeped through the leather flight jacket and woolen uniform of Oberleutnant Erich Hartmann. At 85.0 meters over the Romanian oil fields of Ploiesti, the outside air temperature was minus 40 degrees Celsius. He flexed his fingers inside their fur-lined gloves, watching his breath crystallize into a fine mist inside the cramped cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G. The canopy glass was rimed with frost at the edges, but the view ahead was a breathtaking, terrifying expanse of endless blue. It was 11:17 hours on the morning of June 10, 1944. Below, the sprawling, blackened complex of refineries and cracking towers that fueled the German war machine smoldered from the previous day's raid. The air still carried the faint, acrid tang of burned petroleum and high explosives, a smell that even at this altitude seemed to cling to the inside of his nostrils. Through his headset crackled the voice of his wingman, Feldwebel Johann Hansi Bauer. Quiet as a church mouse, Erich. Maybe the Amis got tired of losing their big, slow bombers to our flak. There was a lazy confidence in the tone, born of 143 combat missions flown together. Hartmann allowed himself a thin smile, his eyes never stopping their methodical scan of the sky, high, low, behind, and to the flanks. Don't get comfortable, Hansi. They'll be back. They always come back. But even as he said it, a part of him shared his friend's dismissiveness. For months, the American bomber streams, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, had been bleeding themselves white over the Reich and its periphery. The missions of the 8th and 15th Air Forces were becoming grimly predictable. They would come in vast, box formation armadas, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, flying straight and level to their targets. And the German defenders, the Jagdflieger, would slaughter them. Hartmann's own score stood at 158 confirmed victories. Over 80 of those were heavy bombers. He had developed the tactic himself. Avoid the deadly forward arc, approach from the rear at the same speed, aim for the wing roots or engines, fire a short, devastating burst from his 20 cannons and 13 machine guns, then break away before the defensive fire from the bomber's waist and tail gunners could find him. It was clinical, efficient, and brutally effective. The American bombers, for all their defensive firepower, were sitting ducks for a skilled pilot in a nimble 109. Their own fighter escorts, the P-38 Lightnings and early model P-47 Thunderbolts, had never been able to stay with them all the way to the target. They would turn back at the limit of their fuel, leaving the bombers naked and vulnerable. The German pilots called it the happy time. His gaze drifted to the small, black and white photograph wedged next to his instrument panel. Ursula, his wife, smiled back, her face frozen in a pre-war summer. He touched the edge of the photo with a gloved finger. Every kill brought him closer to going home to her. Every bomber that fell was a step toward ending this war with Germany victorious. The recent intelligence briefings had been almost boastful. American production was impressive, yes, but it was quantity over quality. Their pilots were inadequately trained, their tactics rigid and predictable. Their fighters were heavy, unmaneuverable flying barn doors that couldn't compete with the refined, battle-tested engineering of German aircraft. What none of the briefings mentioned, what the high command in Berlin seemed to willfully ignore, were the scattered, increasingly frantic reports from the Western Front over the past few months. Reports that spoke of a new American fighter, one that could somehow appear at altitudes previously thought unreachable for escorts, one that could dive with the ferocity of a Stuka and outrun a 109 in level flight. These reports were uniformly dismissed. Pilot error, exaggeration under stress, misidentification. The official line from the Luftwaffe's technical office was clear. Based on the laws of physics and known Allied technology, what these pilots described was impossible. The Americans simply did not have the engineering prowess or the engine technology to produce such a machine. Hartmann had seen one such report stamped unlikely in red ink and filed away. He had shrugged it off himself. After all, he had never seen it. And in the air over Ploiesti that morning, with the sun warming his cockpit and the familiar hum of his Daimler-Benz engine in his ears, the idea that the Americans had secretly built a weapon that could shatter the very foundations of German aerial supremacy seemed like the stuff of fantasy. But high above the Reich, a fantasy was being forged into brutal reality, and the men who would deliver it were already in the air, climbing through the thin, cold stratosphere toward a rendezvous with history and with Erich Hartmann. The confidence that permeated the Luftwaffe in early 1944 was not baseless arrogance. It was built upon a solid edifice of proven success and deeply held beliefs. For years, German fighter pilots had dominated the skies of Europe. The Spanish Civil War had been their testing ground, the blitzkrieg across Poland and France their triumphant proof. Over the English Channel, despite ultimate strategic failure, German aces had racked up staggering kill counts against the RAF. On the Eastern Front, pilots like Hartmann had become living legends, achieving scores that seemed superhuman. The technology appeared to back them up. The Bf-109, though continually refined, was a known quantity, a lightweight, agile interceptor with a powerful engine. The newer Focke-Wulf FW-190 was a revelation, arguably the finest piston-engine fighter of the early war years, faster and more heavily armed than anything the Allies initially fielded. German intelligence assessments of American capabilities were a cocktail of accurate data, cultural prejudice, and catastrophic underestimation. The Abwehr and Luftwaffe intelligence branches dutifully collected information. They knew, for instance, that the United States had begun mass-producing a new, heavier fighter called the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Their initial reports, based on observations from Tunisia and Sicily in 1943, were dismissive. They noted its size. It was enormous, nearly twice the weight of a Bf-109. They nicknamed it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, or, more derisively, Der Fliegende Fass, the Flying Barrel. Its reported performance was unimpressive. Mediocre climb rate, sluggish acceleration, poor maneuverability at low to medium altitudes. Compared to the sleek, predatory lines of the 109, the Thunderbolt looked like a clumsy brute. The intelligence estimates of American production numbers were where the failure began. German analysts, steeped in their own industrial experience, simply could not extrapolate the true scale of the American colossus. A report from January 1944, circulated to Grupp commanders like Hartmann's, estimated that Republic Aviation's Farmingdale, New York plant could produce, at maximum wartime effort, perhaps 150 P-47s per month. The reality was already 5 times that number, and climbing. While German aircraft production was fragmented, plagued by material shortages, and vulnerable to bombing, American factories were hitting their stride in a way no European mind, conditioned by centuries of resource-limited warfare, could fully comprehend. This intelligence failure was compounded by a profound cultural and racial bias. Many in the German high command, and indeed among the pilot corps, held a contemptuous view of American society. They saw a nation of shopkeepers and farmers, a materialistic, decadent culture without martial spirit or the will for sacrifice. How could such a people produce warriors to match the hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe, men who had been fighting since 1939? American pilots were caricatured as spoiled, overconfident boys who relied on technology to compensate for lack of skill and courage. A captured Allied training manual was translated and circulated as a joke. Its emphasis on pilot safety and standardized procedures was seen as proof of a soft, procedural mindset utterly alien to the individualistic, knightly ethos of the German ace. The technical comparisons, printed in Luftwaffe recognition manuals and briefing documents, told a comforting story. A side-by-side table would list the Bf-109G-6 against the P-47D. On paper, based on data from mid-1943, the 109 held advantages in rate of climb, maneuverability at most altitudes, and perhaps even in level speed at lower altitudes. The Thunderbolt's advantages: heavier armament, 850 caliber machine guns versus the 109's mix of cannon and machine guns, rugged construction, and potentially higher dive speed, were acknowledged but downplayed. The prevailing German tactical doctrine valued agility and the first, killing burst. A dogfighter, not a boom-and-zoom energy fighter. The Thunderbolt, they concluded, was unsuited to the fluid, turning combat of the European theater. It was a ground attack aircraft, or a clumsy bomber escort that would be easy meat for the nimble German defenders. There were dissenting voices, of course. A few seasoned commanders who had faced the newer P-47s over France in early 1944 sent back disturbing reports. One such officer was Major Gunther Rahl, a legendary ace with over 200 victories. After a difficult engagement in March, he reportedly told his staff that the new Thunderbolts were a different breed altogether, and that German pilots would have to revise their tactics. His comments were noted, but the institutional inertia was immense. The Luftwaffe was overstretched, fighting a multi-front war of attrition. To admit that the technological edge had not just been neutralized, but potentially reversed, was a psychological and logistical impossibility. It was easier to assume the pilots making these claims were tired, or that they had encountered a rare, specially modified version. The core belief held firm. The German fighter pilot in his superior machine was master of the sky. The coming months would test that belief to destruction, and the instrument of that test was being born not in a single brilliant flash of inspiration, but in the relentless, humming vastness of American industry. The story of the weapon that would break the Luftwaffe is not one of a single genius, but of an entire nation's industrial and engineering might focused on a singular problem. The P-47 Thunderbolt's transformation from the clumsy, flying barrel of German intelligence reports into the deadliest Allied fighter of the European war was a saga of numbers, innovation, and scale that defied Axis comprehension. At the heart of this transformation was an engineering challenge that had stumped every other air force: how to maintain fighter engine power in the thin air of high altitude. The solution was the turbo supercharger, a complex piece of machinery that used exhaust gases to drive a turbine, which in turn compressed air before feeding it into the engine. While other nations experimented with them, only the Americans, specifically the engineers at Pratt & Whitney and Republic Aviation, made it work reliably on a mass-produced fighter. The man most responsible was Alexander Kartveli, a brilliant Georgian-born aeronautical engineer. A refugee from the Russian Revolution, Kartveli embodied the immigrant talent that supercharged American industry. He and his team worked brutal hours, often 16-hour days, for over a year to integrate the massive turbo supercharger system into the Thunderbolt's airframe. The technical hurdles were immense. The system required intricate ductwork running from the engine to the turbo in the rear fuselage and back again. It generated tremendous heat and stress. Early prototypes failed catastrophically, but Kartveli persisted, solving one problem after another with a combination of theoretical brilliance and practical improvisation. The result was an engine system of unprecedented sophistication and power. The Pratt & Whitney RMS 2000 800 double wasp radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower. Fed by the turbo supercharger, it lost almost none of that power at 30,000 feet, 91.0 meters. This was the revelation that German intelligence had missed entirely. While the Bf-109's Daimler-Benz engine, with its simpler mechanical supercharger, gasped for air and lost over half its power above 7,000 meters, the Thunderbolt's engine sang with undiminished fury. At altitude, the P-47D wasn't just competitive. It was dominant. It could reach speeds of 426 mph, 686 km/h, at 30,000 feet, nearly 70 mph faster than a Bf-109G at the same height. Its rate of climb, once a weakness, became formidable in the thin upper air. But raw performance was only part of the story. The Thunderbolt was built for survival in a way German aircraft, designed for performance above all else, were not. It was a flying tank. The cockpit was surrounded by armor plate. The fuel tanks were equipped with a revolutionary self-sealing system called wet stowage, where the rubber lining would swell and plug holes when exposed to gasoline, reducing fire risk by over 80%. The aircraft could absorb punishment that would shatter a 109. Stories began to circulate among American pilots of Thunderbolts returning to base with cylinders shot off the engine, with gaping holes in wings and tail, with hydraulic fluid streaming behind them, and still flying. Then there were the guns. 8 Browning M1250 caliber machine guns, mounted 4 to a wing, with 267 rounds per gun. This gave the P-47 a rate of fire of 32.0 rounds per minute. The combined weight of fire was over 13 pounds per second. A 2-second burst delivered more than 150 rounds of high-explosive and armor-piercing ammunition into a target. The German 20 cannon was more destructive per hit, but it fired slower, and ammunition was limited. The Thunderbolt's wall of lead was terrifyingly accurate and could shred an aircraft from nose to tail in a single pass. All of this technology would have meant little if it remained in short supply. This is where the American miracle truly manifested. While Messerschmitt's main plant in Regensburg struggled to produce 250 Bf-109s a month under constant threat of bombing, Republic Aviation's Farmingdale factory was a monument to efficiency. By early 1944, it was producing not 150 P-47s a month, but over 400. A second plant in Evansville, Indiana, added hundreds more. The production numbers are staggering. 15,683 P-47s were built before the war's end. In 1944 alone, the U.S. produced more than 6,000 Thunderbolts. To put this in perspective, Germany produced approximately 34,000 Bf-109s of all types over the entire war. In the single year of 1944, America produced nearly as many P-47s as Germany had produced 109s in the previous 3 years of total war. This was the hidden reality, the seismic shift that German intelligence, blinded by prejudice and limited data, failed to detect. It wasn't about one better fighter. It was about an avalanche of better fighters, piloted by men who were not the poorly trained novices of German myth, but who were now receiving the most extensive flight training program in history, their skills honed on a relentless conveyor belt of new aircraft. The flying barrel was a myth. What was coming was a high-altitude interceptor of devastating speed, firepower, and resilience, and it was coming not in dozens, but in thousands. The first, tentative signs of this new reality had already begun to flicker on the Luftwaffe's radar screens. But like distant thunder before a storm, they were easy to ignore until the deluge was upon them. The warnings began as whispers, isolated incidents that contradicted the official narrative. They were the cracks in the dam of German confidence, each one individually small, but together telling a story no one in authority wanted to hear. In late February 1944, during the intense air battles over the invasion coast of France, a seasoned Staffel-Captain of JG-26, Hauptmann Walter Krupinski, returned from a sortie visibly shaken. He reported engaging a formation of P-47s near Abbeville. The combat had started normally, with the Germans holding the altitude advantage. But when Krupinski dove on a Thunderbolt, expecting the usual sluggish response, the American fighter not only matched his dive but began to overtake him, pulling away with what he described as unearthly acceleration. He only escaped by using a low-altitude cloud layer. His written report, filed that evening, stated plainly, "The performance envelope of the enemy aircraft, particularly in the dive and at altitudes above 7,000 meters, exceeds that of our Bf-109G. This represents a significant and dangerous development." The report was forwarded to Luftflotte 3 headquarters. A week later, a polite acknowledgement came back, suggesting the Hauptmann had likely encountered a specially modified reconnaissance variant and advising closer attention to aircraft recognition. On March 15, a young lieutenant flying a Focke-Wulf 190 over Belgium made a frantic radio call to his controller. "Bandits high, very high, Angels 30,000 feet." The controller, consulting his charts which listed the P-47's practical combat ceiling as 25,000 feet, assumed the pilot was misidentifying a high-flying Mosquito or was simply mistaken. "Confirm altitude," he radioed back. "I confirm they are above me. I cannot reach them." The controller logged the call as unconfirmed sighting, probable error. More concrete and more chilling were the loss statistics that began to tick upward in the spring of 1944. The Luftwaffe's Quartermaster General kept meticulous records. In January and February, the loss ratio between German fighters and American fighters in Western Europe had been roughly 1.2, acceptable, if not ideal. By April, that ratio had shifted to 1.8. By May, it was approaching 2.5. Experienced experts were being lost at an alarming rate, not in dramatic, large-scale battles, but in small, confusing engagements where the Americans seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with overwhelming force, and then vanish. The official explanation from the inspector of fighters, the great ace Adolf Galland, was attrition. The Luftwaffe was simply flying more sorties against overwhelming numbers, and losses were inevitable. The quality of the average German pilot was declining as training was shortened, while the Americans were improving. This was all true, but it was not the whole truth. A crucial piece of evidence arrived in the form of a captured, nearly intact P-47D that made a forced landing in a Dutch field in April 1944. The aircraft was quickly dismantled and shipped to the Luftwaffe's top-secret evaluation center at Richlin. German engineers pored over it. They were astonished by its construction, the thickness of its skin, the complexity of its turbo-supercharger ductwork, the sheer robustness of every component. Performance estimates were calculated based on the engine and airframe. The numbers were shocking. They suggested a level of high-altitude performance that matched the most alarming pilot reports. A preliminary report was drafted, marked Secret Urgent. It stated that the P-47D, when operating above 8,000 meters, was superior in speed and dive performance to all current German frontline fighters. The report recommended an immediate tactical shift. Avoid engaging Thunderbolts at high altitude. Force them to fight at lower levels where the Bf-109 and FW-190 still held advantages. This Richlin report was a bombshell. It also represented a direct threat to established dogma and to the reputations of senior commanders who had dismissed the earlier warnings. The report was debated at a high-level conference in Berlin. Some, like Galland, argued for its immediate dissemination. Others, including influential figures in the technical office and the high command, pushed back. They questioned the evaluation methods. Perhaps the captured aircraft was a special, high-altitude version, not representative of the general fleet. Disseminating such alarming information, they argued, would damage pilot morale unnecessarily. The conference ended with a compromise. The report would be classified as for commanders only, and its conclusions would be incorporated into a general, watered-down tactical advisory about the variability of Allied aircraft performance. The urgent, specific warning about the Thunderbolt's high-altitude supremacy was buried in bureaucracy. By the time a sanitized version trickled down to frontline Gruppen in late May, It was too vague to trigger any meaningful change in tactics. The psychology at work was a textbook case of denial in the face of existential threat. To accept the Richlin report was to accept that the technological foundation of the Luftwaffe's defense of the Reich was crumbling. It was to admit that American engineering had not just caught up, but had leaped ahead in a critical domain. For men who had built their identities and their nation's strategy on qualitative superiority, this was an unbearable cognitive dissonance. It was easier, safer, to cling to the old beliefs, to attribute the rising losses to numbers, to bad luck, to the declining skill of new pilots, to anything but the terrifying possibility that the enemy had built a better weapon. And so, as June 1944 dawned, the Luftwaffe fighter arm flew into battle with a flawed understanding of its opponent. They were prepared for the P-47 of 1943, the heavy, low-altitude fighter that couldn't escort bombers to Berlin. They were utterly unprepared for the P-47 of 1944, the high-altitude predator that was about to rewrite the rules of the air war over Europe. The final, irrefutable warning was already painting itself across the radar screens of German early warning stations. But in the command bunkers, the men reading those screens saw only what they expected to see: another bomber stream. They had no conception of the fighter escort that was climbing with it, higher than any escort had ever flown before, waiting for the signal to descend and unleash hell. The morning of June 10, 1944, dawned with a specific, critical mission for the USAAF. Ploiesti had to be hit again, and this time the bombers would not go alone. Operation Frantic was underway, and deep penetration raids were being supported by a new doctrine: full fighter escort, all the way to the target and back. The plan was audacious. From bases in Italy, over 200 B-17s of the 15th Air Force would strike the Romanian refineries. Their escort would be provided by the 325th Fighter Group, the Checkertail Clan, flying the very machines German intelligence had so grossly misjudged. The P-47D Thunderbolt. In the lead aircraft of one of the 325th's flights, Captain John Jack Ilfrey checked his oxygen flow and glanced at his wingman. They had been climbing for nearly 40 minutes, their powerful R-2800 engines driving them upward in a shallow, fuel-saving ascent. The Thunderbolts were heavy, each carrying a 150-gallon drop tank under the belly to extend their range. Ilfrey watched the altimeter needle sweep past 25,000 feet, then 27,000. The sky was turning from blue to a deep, dark indigo. At 30,000 feet, he leveled off. The temperature outside was -50 degrees Fahrenheit. The bomber stream was a distant, shimmering constellation of silver specks 10 miles ahead and slightly below. His group's job was high cover, to loiter above the bombers, a guardian angel force to pounce on any German fighters that tried to dive from the sun. Ilfrey's aircraft was no ordinary P-47. It was a D-22 model, one of the first to feature a new bubble canopy that replaced the old Razorback design, giving the pilot near -360-degree visibility. More importantly, it had the latest engine modifications and a paddle blade propeller that boosted high-altitude performance even further. He was flying a machine that represented the absolute cutting edge of Allied fighter technology, a machine whose specifications existed only as dismissed rumors in German files. He switched his radio to the group frequency. Checkertail lead to all flights. We're at Angels 30. Bombers are at Angels 25. Keep your eyes peeled. Intel says the 109s are active in this sector. He didn't know it, but he was flying directly toward Erich Hartmann's patrol area. Below and ahead, the first wave of B-17s began its bomb run. The sky over Ploiesti erupted. Black puffs of flak blossomed with sickening regularity, stitching a deadly tapestry through the bomber formations. The deep crump of explosions was audible even through the Thunderbolt's thick canopy. Then the familiar, dreaded sight: tiny, dark specks like swarming gnats, rising from airfields around the city. The German fighters were scrambling. Hartmann saw them first. "Hansi, look, 11 o'clock low, the Wehrmachts are here." His voice was calm, professional. He counted the specks. A large formation, maybe 40 or 50 bombers. He scanned the sky around them for the telltale glint of escort fighters. He saw nothing above or beside the bomber stream. Just the usual high, thin contrails, too high to be fighters. His heart rate ticked up slightly, the old, familiar combat focus narrowing his world to the cockpit, the sky, and the enemy. Jagdgeschwader 52, this is Carrier 1. Bandits sighted. Engaging bombers. Hansi with me. We'll take the ones on the left flank. He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the 109 surge ahead. The plan was standard. Use their altitude advantage to make a high-speed diving pass on the bombers, fire a burst into a wing or engine, then use their superior low-altitude speed to break away and climb for another pass. It had worked 100 times. He led his swarm of 4 aircraft into a shallow dive, lining up on a B-17 at the edge of the formation. He was completely focused on the bomber, calculating deflection, watching for the defensive fire from its top and ball turrets. He was a hunter closing on his prey. At 32,000 feet, Jack Ilfrey saw them. The glint of sunlight on wings, the distinct silhouettes of Bf-109s peeling off from a holding pattern and beginning their death dive toward his bombers. He keyed his mic. Checkertail lead, bandits at 6 o'clock low to the bombers, diving in. Green flight, red flight with me. Break tanks and follow me down. Blue flight, stay high and cover. A chorus of Wilco and Roger crackled in his ears. With a practiced motion, he hit the release for his now empty drop tank, watching it tumble away. Then he pushed the Thunderbolt's nose down. The sensation was unlike anything in any other aircraft. The P-47 didn't just dive. It sank. The heavy airframe, combined with the tremendous power of its engine and the clean lines of the new bubble canopy, turned it into an aerodynamic spear. The airspeed indicator began to climb with terrifying speed, 350 mph, 400, 450. The controls grew stiff, but the aircraft remained rock solid. Ilfrey was aimed not at the 109s, but at a point in space ahead of them, an intercept trajectory. He was converting 7,000 feet of altitude into pure, murderous velocity. Hartmann was seconds from firing range. He could see the details of the B-17 now, the olive-drab paint, the rows of windows, the waist gunners swinging their weapons toward him. Then, a flicker in his peripheral vision. High at his 1 o'clock, a fast-moving shadow. He glanced up, expecting to see a stray bomber or perhaps a late-arriving escort. What he saw made his blood run cold. 4 aircraft, diving at an angle so steep it seemed vertical. They were big, with distinctive, rounded noses and broad wings. Thunderbolts. But they were moving with a speed that defied belief. They weren't just diving. They were falling out of the sky like avenging angels, closing the distance between 32,000 feet and his altitude of 24,000 feet in what seemed like heartbeats. The math in his head, the math based on every briefing and performance chart he'd ever seen, screamed that this was impossible. No fighter that heavy could dive that fast without ripping its wings off. Yet there they were, growing larger with terrifying rapidity. "Hansi, break! Break right! Fighters high!" he yelled into the radio, abandoning his attack on the bomber and wrenching his stick to the right. The 109 responded instantly, rolling into a tight turn. He looked back over his shoulder. The lead Thunderbolt had leveled out of its dive not behind him, but in front of him, having used its insane dive speed to cut him off. It was now turning into him, its 8-gun ports in the wings looking like the eyes of a spider. The distance was less than 800 meters. In that frozen slice of time, a dozen disconnected realizations slammed into Hartmann's mind. The aircraft was different, sleeker, with a clear canopy. It had retained enough energy from its dive to maneuver aggressively at this altitude, where his own 109 felt sluggish. And it was between him and the safety of the clouds below. The comfortable, predictable calculus of the happy time evaporated. He was no longer the hunter. He was prey. Ilfrey lined up the fleeing 109 in his K-14 gyroscopic gun sight. The Pipper settled just ahead of the German fighter's nose. He could see the distinctive black crosses on the fuselage, the yellow theater markings on the nose. He squeezed the trigger. The sound was apocalyptic. A deep, ripping brrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr unison. Tracers, 1 in every 5 rounds, stitched a fiery line through the sky. Hartman saw the flashes and instinctively snapped into a break left, then right, a desperate defensive scissors. The first bursts missed, but the Thunderbolt stayed with him, its pilot matching his turns with a precision that spoke of training and a machine with ample power. The radio in Hartman's cockpit erupted in chaos. "Carrier 2, I'm hit. Engines gone. Brake, they're everywhere. I can't shake him, he's too fast." A scream, then static. Hartman caught a glimpse of Hansi's aircraft trailing smoke, spiraling down toward the ground. Rage and fear mixed in his gut. He pulled back on the stick, trying to climb, to use the 109's legendary rate of climb to escape. The engine roared, but the climb felt slow, labored. He glanced in his mirror. The Thunderbolt was still there, hanging on his tail like a shadow, climbing with him. Not just keeping up, gaining. The report from Richlin, the one he'd never seen, flashed through his mind. Superior in speed and climb performance above 8,000 meters. He was at 85,000 meters. He tried a last, desperate maneuver, a high-speed yo-yo, trading airspeed for altitude. The Thunderbolt pilot anticipated it, cutting inside his turn. The distance closed to 300 meters. Ilfrey fired again. This time, Hartman felt the impacts. A sound like hail on a tin roof as rounds punched through his left wing. The aileron controls went sloppy. A warning light flashed on his panel, fuel leak. The smell of raw gasoline and cordite filled the cockpit. He broke off the climb, shoving the stick forward into another dive, aiming for the deck where the 109 might still have an edge. The Thunderbolt followed, but this time Hartman noticed something. It wasn't gaining as rapidly. The dive was still fearsome, but the gap wasn't closing as it had before. A wild hope flared. Maybe its incredible dive speed was a one-time trick, a product of that initial altitude advantage. Maybe if he could just reach the treetops, he could lose it. He spiraled down through the flak, weaving through the black smoke, the earth rushing up to meet him. At 2,000 feet, he leveled out, skimming over the Romanian countryside. He risked a look back. The Thunderbolt was still there, a dark shape against the brighter sky, but it was farther back. It seemed to be hanging back, not pressing the attack as aggressively. Hartman's mind, trained to analyze combat, seized on this. Was the pilot low on ammunition, cautious about the ground fire? Or was there another, more technical reason? What he couldn't know was that Ilfrey, low on fuel after the long escort mission and the high-speed dive, had been ordered not to chase stragglers too far. The primary mission was to protect the bombers, not pursue individual kills. But Ilfrey had one more lesson to teach. As Hartman streaked for the sanctuary of his airfield, thinking he had perhaps outrun the monster, Ilfrey did something no German pilot expected a Thunderbolt to do at low altitude. He pushed the throttle to the firewall. The R-2800, even at low altitude, produced over 2,000 horsepower. The P-47, now clean of its drop tank and lighter from spent ammunition, began to accelerate, slowly at first, then with gathering force. The airspeed climbed, 350 mph, 375-400. Hartman, watching in his mirror, saw the distance begin to close again. His hope curdled into disbelief. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a high-altitude specialist, it was fast at any altitude. The reports, the dismissals, the official charts, all of it was wrong. Completely, catastrophically wrong. He was 10 miles from his base. The airfield was in sight. He radioed frantically for landing clearance for flak support. He could see the runway. Then the ripping sound again. BRRRRRRRAP. This time the tracers weren't just close. They converged. He felt a massive impact as rounds tore into his engine. The Daimler-Benz coughed, belched black smoke, and seized. The propeller windmilled to a stop. Silence except for the scream of the wind and the pounding of his own heart. He was gliding, a dead stick, with a relentless enemy still behind him. He jettisoned the canopy, the slipstream tearing at his clothes. The ground was coming up fast. He had one chance. He pulled back on the stick, bleeding off speed, aiming for a flat field beside the runway. The world tilted, trees flashed past, and then came the jarring, bone-rattling impact of a wheels-up landing. The 109 skidded across the dirt, tearing off its wings, coming to rest in a cloud of dust and debris. Dazed, Hartman unbuckled his harness and stumbled from the wreck. He looked up, expecting to see the Thunderbolt making a victory pass. But the sky was empty. The American had broken off, mission accomplished. Hartman stood there, leaning against the hot metal of his destroyed fighter, his lungs heaving, his uniform soaked in sweat. He looked at the bullet holes stitched across the fuselage, the shattered engine. He had survived. But in that moment, survival felt like a bitter consolation prize. He had just encountered the future of air combat, and it had humiliated him. The myth of German invincibility lay shattered in the Romanian dirt beside his plane. But this was just one engagement, one pilot's shocking awakening. As Hartman was being driven back to his base in a stunned silence, a far larger drama was unfolding across the breadth of the Reich. The encounter over Ploiesti was not an anomaly. It was the first, tremulous note of a symphony of destruction. For on that same day, and in the days that followed, the United States Army Air Forces were unleashing the full, terrifying potential of their industrial might in a coordinated offensive that would come to be known as Big Week, on a continuous, rolling basis. The P-47 Thunderbolts, joined by the equally formidable North American P-51 Mustangs, now arriving in overwhelming numbers, were not just escorting bombers, they were hunting the Luftwaffe. The warning signs the German High Command had ignored were about to coalesce into an undeniable, catastrophic reality. While individual pilots like Hartman licked their wounds and tried to process their traumatic encounters, the machinery of American air power was shifting gears. The strategy was no longer purely defensive escort. New orders went out to the fighter groups: destroy the enemy in the air, destroy him on the ground. Your first priority is the destruction of the Luftwaffe. In England, at bases carpeting the East Anglian countryside, hundreds of Thunderbolts and Mustangs were being armed not just for escort, but for long-range fighter sweeps. They would fly ahead of the bombers, clearing the skies, attacking airfields, strafing anything that moved. The technological surprise, the high-altitude performance, the devastating firepower, the ruggedness, was now being married to an aggressive, offensive doctrine. The Germans, still reeling from the shock of discovering that their enemy's fighters could reach them anywhere, were about to discover something worse: that those fighters were now actively hunting them, with a reach and a ferocity that defied all their pre-war planning. The intelligence failure was now complete. The Luftwaffe's command structure, from the frontline Gruppenkommandeur to the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe in Berlin, operated on a picture of the enemy that was weeks, if not months, out of date. They believed they were facing a capable but predictable foe. They were, in fact, facing an adaptive, technologically superior, and logistically unstoppable force that was learning and evolving at a pace they could not match. The reports of strange, high-flying fighters were no longer scattered anomalies. They were the daily reality for every pilot who scrambled to intercept the endless streams of bombers that now darkened the skies of Central Europe. And as Hartmann's shattered Messerschmitt was being towed off the Romanian field, the first of those endless streams was crossing the Dutch coast, escorted by a swarm of fighters that flew higher and faster than anything the Luftwaffe's radar operators had been trained to recognize. The truck ride back to the airfield at Mizzle took 20 minutes. Hartman sat in silence, the driver, a young corporal, glancing at him nervously in the rearview mirror but saying nothing. The base was in chaos. Ambulances screamed toward the runway where other crippled fighters were attempting emergency landings. Mechanics ran across the tarmac, their faces smudged with oil and anxiety. Hartman climbed out of the truck, his legs unsteady. He saw his Gruppenkommandeur, Major Gerhard Barkhorn, striding toward him, his face a mask of controlled fury. Barkhorn, with over 250 victories, was a legend, but at that moment he looked like a man watching his world collapse. Hartman, report. The voice was clipped, devoid of its usual casual confidence. Hartman saluted, his mind struggling to form coherent sentences. Sir, we engaged the bombers as planned. Then fighters, thunderbolts. They came from above, higher than we were, much higher. Their dive speed, it was impossible. They cut us off. Hansi is gone. My aircraft was shot to pieces. I barely made it down. Barkhorn's eyes narrowed. He had heard similar reports over the past week, but from junior pilots, men with less experience. Hearing it from Hartman, his top scorer, a man whose judgment he trusted implicitly, was different. From how high? I was at 24,000 feet. They were at least 30, maybe 32. They dove like stones, sir. And then they matched my climb. At 8,000 meters, they were faster than me. A staff car screeched to a halt nearby, and the wing intelligence officer, a bespectacled Hauptmann from Berlin, hurried over. Major, the preliminary tally from the raid is coming in. It is not good. How not good? The intelligence officer consulted his clipboard, his hand trembling slightly. Of the 32 aircraft from our group that scrambled this morning, 22 made contact with the enemy. We have confirmed 4 bombers destroyed, possibly 2 more damaged. Barkhorn stared. And our losses, the officer swallowed. 11 aircraft failed to return. 4 more are write-offs, including Oberleutnant Hartmann's. 3 others are heavily damaged. That is, 18 aircraft lost, sir, for 4 bombers. The number hung in the air like poison gas. A loss ratio of nearly 5 to 1. In the past, they would have considered it a disaster to lose 2 fighters for 10 bombers. This was an order of magnitude worse. Barkhorn turned away, running a hand through his hair. Get the surviving pilots debriefed. I want every detail, everything they saw, everything they felt. Performance characteristics, tactics, markings, everything. As Hartman walked toward the operations hut, he passed the dispersal area where the remaining serviceable Bf-109 sat. He counted them, 14, from a full-strength group of 36 that morning. In a single mission they had been halved, and this was not some elite Allied fighter unit they had faced. It was a bomber escort mission. The Americans had not been trying to dogfight. They had been protecting their charges, and in doing so, they had annihilated the interceptors. Inside the debriefing room, the atmosphere was funereal. Pilots sat slumped in chairs, some with bandages, all with the hollow-eyed stare of men who had just stared into the abyss. The intelligence officer stood at the front, his pointer tapping a map. Please describe the enemy fighter tactics. A young lieutenant, his face still pale with shock, spoke first. They didn't dogfight, not like we understand it. They dove, fired a single, very long burst 2-3 seconds, then used their speed to climb away. They didn't turn with us. They just hit and ran, over and over. Another pilot, a veteran Oberfeldwebel with 60 victories, chimed in, his voice rough. Their guns, my God, their guns. It was like being hit by a hose of fire. I saw Rudy's 109 hit. The entire tail section just disintegrated. It wasn't cannon fire. It was a hailstorm. Hartman added, his own voice sounding strange to his ears. They have a new model. The canopy is all glass, no frame behind the pilot. It gives them better visibility. And their engines, they do not lose power. At altitude, my 109 was gasping. His was screaming. The intelligence officer noted it all down, but Hartman could see the skepticism still lingering in his eyes. The man was a product of the system, a believer in the technical manuals that now seemed like works of fiction. The door opened and Barkhorn entered again, holding a fresh teletype message. His face was grim. This just came from Luftflotte headquarters. The raid we faced was part of a coordinated attack. While we were engaged here, over 800 bombers with full fighter escort struck synthetic fuel plants across central Germany. Luna Politz Brooks. He paused, letting the name sink in. Preliminary reports indicate catastrophic damage to production. And the fighter losses. He looked at the paper, then back at his men. Across all defending Jeschwader today, we lost 138 fighters confirmed destroyed. The Americans lost 28. A collective gasp went through the room, a loss ratio of nearly 5-to-1 on a strategic scale. This was no local anomaly over Ploiesti. This was a systemic collapse. The message, Barkhorn continued, his voice dropping, includes new tactical directives from General der Jagdflieger Galland. It states that the P-47 Thunderbolt, particularly in its latest variants, presents a severe threat at altitudes above 7,000 meters. It advises to avoid turning engagements and to attempt to draw them to lower altitudes. Hartmann almost laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Advises? It's a little late for advice, Herr Major. They dictate the terms of the engagement. They have the altitude, they have the speed. We cannot draw them down. They choose when to fight. The intelligence officer cleared his throat. The directive also mentions that a new fighter, the P-51 Mustang with even longer range, is now appearing in significant numbers. It suggests that the era of unescorted bomber streams is over. The room fell silent. The unspoken words hung in the air. The era of German aerial supremacy is over. The shockwave of June 10th rippled across the Luftwaffe with the speed of a .50 caliber round. In the following week, the evidence became overwhelming, written in the smoking wreckage of German fighters that littered the fields from the Romanian plains to the German heartland. The statistics, when finally compiled by a horrified quartermaster general's office, told a story of unmitigated disaster. Between June 10 and June 30, 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 1,227 fighter aircraft in operations against the Western Allies. Of these, post-war analysis would attribute approximately 70% to encounters with P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. The American fighter loss rate for the same period was 247 aircraft. The kill ratio had exploded to almost 5, 1 in favor of the Americans. But raw numbers only told part of the story. The quality of the losses was devastating. In that 3-week period, the Luftwaffe lost 412 experienced expert pilots with more than 20 victories. These were men who could not be replaced in 6 months of accelerated training. They were the institutional memory, the tactical leaders, the living proof of German superiority. They were being systematically exterminated. At the same time, the Allied fighter offensive expanded beyond escort. Operation Crossbow targeted V-1 launch sites, but the fighter sweeps that accompanied them, dubbed Chattanooga Choo-Choo missions by the Americans, focused on the Luftwaffe itself. Thunderbolt groups, now often carrying 500-pound bombs or high-velocity rockets under their wings, began hunting German aircraft on the ground. A typical report from JG-3, based in France, dated June 18, read, at 6:30 hours, the airfield was attacked by approximately 40 P-47s. No warning was received. They destroyed 22 Bf-109s on the ground, the maintenance hangar, and the fuel dump. Anti-aircraft defenses accounted for 1 attacker. Our total fighter strength in this sector is now reduced to 8 serviceable aircraft. The German response was a frantic, disjointed scramble that highlighted the profound institutional failure. Engineers at Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt were ordered to produce emergency high-altitude versions of the FW-190 and Bf-109. The FW-190D with a lengthened nose and a Junkers Jumo inline engine, was rushed into production. It was an excellent fighter, finally approaching the high-altitude performance of the late-model P-47s. But in June 1944, only 37 were delivered. That same month, Republic Aviation produced 523 P-47D models. The arithmetic was suicidal. Tactical manuals were hastily rewritten, but they were distributed to units that no longer had the veteran pilots to teach the new methods. The advice was often contradictory. One bulletin, issued on June 25, stated, "The Thunderbolt is vulnerable in a turning fight at low speed." It failed to mention that getting a Thunderbolt to slow down required a miracle, and that at low speeds, the P-47's pilot could simply use his massive engine power to accelerate away from any turning 109. Another directive ordered pilots to attack the bombers from the front, a tactic that minimized exposure to the escort fighters, but maximized exposure to the bombers' concentrated forward fire. It was a choice between two forms of suicide. The psychological impact on the German pilot corps was immediate and corrosive. A diary recovered from a lieutenant of JG-11, killed over Magdeburg on June 22, contained this entry. "We are no longer knights. We are cattle being led to the slaughter. The armies fly above us like gods. We scramble, we climb as fast as we can, and then they fall on us from a sky we cannot reach." Müller was shot down today. He bilayed out. As he descended, a thunderbolt circled him twice and then flew away. It did not shoot him. It didn't need to. The message was clear. We own this sky. We all understood. This loss of morale manifested in subtle, then overt ways. Missions were flown with less aggression. Pilots began to claim engine trouble or oxygen failure at the first sign of enemy fighters. The once unthinkable act of abandoning one's aircraft at the first hit became commonplace, as men chose captivity over the near-certain death of trying to nurse a damaged plane home through a sky swarming with predators. The average combat lifespan of a new German pilot arriving at a frontline unit in the summer of 1944 plummeted to less than 3 weeks. While the Western Front burned, the reverberations were felt thousands of miles away. In the vastness of the Pacific, the same industrial juggernaut was crushing the Japanese Empire with a different, yet equally terrifying, manifestation of American technical prowess. At the same moment, Hartmann was crash-landing in Romania. Lieutenant Junior Grade Toshio Hijikata of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 201st Air Group was peering through the windscreen of his Mitsubishi AM-50 over the Philippine Sea. Below him, the Japanese Mobile fleet was under attack by U.S. Navy carrier aircraft. The Zero had been the terror of the Pacific in 1941-42, a nimble, long-range dogfighter that had swept all before it. But like the German intelligence officers, Japanese commanders had fatally underestimated American adaptability. Hijikata saw the enemy dive bombers, Douglas SBD Dauntlesses, wheeling above the fleet. He pushed his stick forward to intercept. Then, from a high, sunlit perch, a shape dropped like a hammer. It was not the familiar, bulky silhouette of an F-4F Wildcat. It was sleek, radial-engined, and impossibly fast in a dive. A Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat, born from the lessons of early combat with the Zero, was the U.S. Navy's answer. Heavier, faster, better armored, and armed with .650 caliber machine guns. It was, in essence, the naval equivalent of the P-47, a purpose-built killer designed to leverage American industrial advantage. Hijikata turned to meet it, relying on the Zero's legendary turn radius. The Hellcat pilot did not turn. He blew past in a high-speed pass, his guns ripping. Hijikata felt his port wing shudder. He reversed his turn, but the Hellcat had already climbed away, using its superior power-to-weight ratio to regain altitude for another dive. It was the same boom and zoom tactic the Thunderbolts were using over Europe, perfectly suited to negate the strengths of the agile Japanese fighter. Hijikata's Zero, like the Bf-109, was a lightweight interceptor built for a different war. Within minutes, the sky was filled with falling Zeros and burning Hellcats, but the ratio was 10-1 against the Japanese. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as it became known, saw Japanese carrier air power annihilated, with over 600 aircraft lost for about 120 American. The parallel was uncanny. A technologically advanced, massively produced American fighter was systematically dismantling an air force built around an earlier generation's conception of aerial combat. Back in Europe, the men trying to stem the tide from behind desks were facing their own nightmare. At the Luftwaffe's technical office in Berlin, Professor Heinrich Hertel, one of Germany's foremost aeronautical engineers, sat in a secure laboratory examining components from the P-47D captured in Holland. The report he was drafting for Reichsmarschall Göring was a masterpiece of reluctant admiration and despair. Subject: Technical Analysis of Republic P-47D Thunderbolt, Work Number 42-26418. It began. The aircraft represents a philosophical approach to fighter design fundamentally opposed to our own, yet one which has proven alarmingly effective in the current high-altitude combat environment. He detailed the turbo-supercharger system, his technical description tinged with awe. The General Electric Type C H-5 turbo-supercharger is mounted in the rear fuselage, fed by exhaust ducts from the engine. The compressed air is returned via an intercooler and a long induction duct to the engine intake. The system is mechanically complex, requiring precise machining and high-quality materials, particularly for the turbine blades which operate at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Its integration is a work of engineering art. It explains the aircraft's maintained horsepower at altitude. Our DB605 engine, with its single-stage, two-speed mechanical supercharger, cannot compete above 75 meters. He moved on to the airframe. The construction is immensely robust. Skin thickness averages 1.5 compared to 0.8 on the Bf-109G. The fuselage is built around a strongbox structure that can withstand enormous G-forces and battle damage. The pilot is protected by 9.5 of armor plate behind his seat, a 57 thick bulletproof glass windscreen, and further plates around the cockpit sides. The fuel tanks are of the wet, self-sealing type, a technology we have been unable to replicate reliably. In tests, 50 caliber rounds piercing the tank caused leaks that sealed within 15 seconds, reducing fire risk by an estimated 85%. His conclusion was damning. The P-47D is not an aeroplane that wins through finesse or superior aerodynamics. It wins through brute force engineering, exceptional survivability, and the ruthless application of industrial capacity to solve a specific problem. High-altitude, high-speed interception. It is a weapon of attrition. To defeat it, we would need a fighter of comparable power and altitude performance produced in similar numbers. The FW-190D-9 shows promise, but its Jumo 213 engine is in critically short supply. The Ta-152 program is years from mass production. In the interim, every encounter between a Bf-109G and a P-47D above 8,000 meters is a foregone conclusion. Our pilots are being sent to die in obsolete machines. Professor Hertel sealed the report and sent it through secure channels. He knew it would likely be ignored, filed away like the Richlin report before it. The truth was too dangerous. At the highest levels of command, the desperation was turning to delusion. In the Wolf's Lair on June 25, Adolf Hitler presided over a situation conference on the air war. The mood was poisonous. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, facing the collapse of his beloved Luftwaffe, sought scapegoats. The pilots lack fighting spirit, he thundered. They are not pressing their attacks. The numbers are impossible. The Americans are lying about their production. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, present at the meeting, had finally had enough. The dashing ace, who had once embodied the Luftwaffe's confidence, now stood with the weary defiance of a man who could no longer stomach the lies. Herr Reichsmarschall, with respect, the pilots are dying in droves. They are facing a technical revolution. The P-47 and now the P-51 are superior to our fighters in every performance category that matters above 5,000 meters. Our pilots are not cowards. They are outclassed. Hitler, who had been staring at a map, looked up, his eyes burning. Then we must produce better fighters. Where are the jet aircraft? The Me-262. Galland took a deep breath. The Me-262 is not yet ready for mass deployment, my Führer. The engines have a lifespan of 25 hours, and even if it were, the Americans are producing thousands of these piston-engine fighters every month. For every Me-262 we build, they build 50 P-47s. It is a war of mathematics we cannot win. The room fell silent. No one had ever spoken such heresy so plainly. Hitler's face contorted. I do not accept this defeatism. The German spirit will triumph over American materialism. The pilots must fight harder. They must embrace the sacrifice. But the sacrifice was already being made in blood every single day. The strategic impact of the Thunderbolt's dominance, coupled with the Mustangs, was now reshaping the entire war in Europe. With the Luftwaffe fighter force being systematically destroyed, the Allies achieved what had been a dream a year before: total air superiority over Western Europe. This single fact made Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion launched just 4 days before Hartmann's encounter, possible. The beaches of Normandy were not threatened by the Luftwaffe. Allied troops and supplies poured ashore under an umbrella of absolute aerial protection. Thunderbolts and Mustangs prowled the skies ahead of the advancing armies, acting as flying artillery, destroying tanks, trains, and troop concentrations with impunity. The German army, once invincible under the cover of the Stuka, now moved only at night or under constant threat of annihilation from the air. The effect was a cascading collapse. With fighters being lost at an unsustainable rate, anti-aircraft flak units were stripped of their best personnel to man new fighter squadrons, weakening ground defenses. Fuel shortages, exacerbated by the successful bombing of synthetic plants, grounded entire Geschwader. Pilots sat on alert, watching the skies, unable to fly for lack of gasoline. When they did fly, they were often led into battle by inexperienced commanders, as the veterans were gone. The intricate, radar-directed defense system that had once made the Reich a fortress began to unravel. Radar stations were priority targets for fighter bombers. The early warning chain broke down. By August 1944, the scale of the defeat was quantifiable in every metric. A secret report from the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, to Hitler, dated August 10, contained the following statistics. Fighter pilot losses, Western Front, May-August 1944. 2812 killed or missing, 1,033 wounded. Total fighter aircraft losses, same period, 4117. Estimated enemy fighter losses to our forces, 1,209. Current monthly fighter production, 1,450. Current monthly pilot training output, 800. Projected depletion of experienced pilot cadre, 100 days. The report concluded with a stark warning. The Luftwaffe fighter arm will cease to exist as an effective fighting force by December 1944 if current loss rates continue. The air war over the Reich has been lost. For the men on the ground, the evidence was all around them. Obergefreiter Karl Müller, a wounded Panzer crewman being evacuated by train from France to Germany in late July, wrote to his sister, "The journey is a nightmare. We travel only at night. During the day we hide in tunnels or forests. The Jabos fighter bombers own the daylight. I have seen trains ahead of us on the line, smashed to splinters, the cargo burned. They strike without warning. There is no Luftwaffe to stop them. It is as if the sky itself has become our enemy. Allied prisoners of war held in Germany saw the proof of the industrial disparity firsthand. Downed American and British airmen, being transported to POW camps, passed through rail hubs near major industrial centers. Captain James Stewart, a B-17 navigator shot down in March 1944 and being moved to Stalag Luft III in August, recorded in his hidden diary, passed through the Ruhr today. The devastation from our bombing is immense, but what struck me was the marshalling yard at Hamm. We were stalled there for hours. Across the tracks was a train loaded with brand new German fighter planes, Messerschmitt 109s, maybe 30 of them. They looked small, almost fragile. The guards were morose. One of them who spoke a little English pointed at them and said, "For 1 week they come, for 1 day they fight, then gone." Then he pointed up at the sky where a lone contrail, too high to identify, streaked west. "You make them faster than we can kill them." He was right. In Michigan, they probably made 30 more while we sat on those tracks. The final, tragic attempt at adaptation came too late. The German High Command, finally accepting the need for a technological leap, pushed the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter into service. It was a wonder weapon, 150 mph faster than any Allied fighter, but it was plagued by problems: unreliable engines, vulnerable landing gear, a shortage of trained pilots, and fatally, Hitler's insistence that it be used as a bomber. When it did engage Allied aircraft, it was devastating, but there were never enough of them. In the entire war, fewer than 1,400 Me 262s were produced. In 1944 alone, America built over 6,000 P-47s and 6,000 P-51s. The jets would score impressive kill ratios, but they were drops in an ocean. They could not protect German airspace, could not stop the bomber streams, could not protect the armies retreating on all fronts. They were a spectacular epitaph for an air force that had bet on quality, only to be buried by quantity married to a later superior quality. For Erich Hartmann, the war continued, a grinding, hopeless descent. He survived Ploiesti, was given a new Bf 109 G-10, a slightly better model, and was sent back into the meat grinder over Hungary and Germany. But the confidence was gone. The nightly duel was over. Every mission was now a calculation of survival. He watched as his friends vanished, one by one. He saw the contrails of the American fighter sweeps, so high they were untouchable, and knew they were the masters of the sky. His victory tally continued to climb. He would eventually become the highest-scoring ace in history, with 352 confirmed kills. But each victory felt emptier, a meaningless number in a war that was already lost. The photograph of Ursula remained in his cockpit, but the dream it represented, returning to a victorious Germany, had turned to ash. He was fighting not to win, but to live, and to protect the men flying beside him for one more day. The culmination came on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Hartmann, now a major, was ordered to fly his unit's remaining aircraft to a designated airfield and surrender to the Americans. He led a ragged formation of 12 Bf 109s and FW 190s, all that remained of a one-sprout Jeschwader, on the short flight. As they approached the field, a flight of 4 P-47 Thunderbolts appeared, circling high above like hawks. They made no aggressive move. They simply watched. Hartmann landed, taxied to the designated area, and cut his engine for the last time. He climbed out, his body aching with a fatigue deeper than any he had ever known. An American jeep drove up, carrying a captain from the USAAF Intelligence Division. The American officer saluted casually. Hartmann returned the salute, his posture still rigid. "Major Hartmann?" the American asked. "Yes, I'm Captain Miller. Welcome to the end of the war." The American's tone was not unkind. He looked at the line of German fighters, their paint faded, their engines silent. Then he looked up at the Thunderbolts still circling. "They'll escort you to the POW enclosure. Standard procedure. Hartman followed his gaze. The sun glinted off the bubble canopies of the P-47s. "They are remarkable machines," he said, the words coming out unbidden. Captain Miller nodded. "They did the job." He paused. "Your score is 352, our intelligence says. That's incredible. You must have seen a lot of changes." Hartman looked at the young American captain, at his clean uniform, his well-fed face, the casual confidence of a man from a world that had never known true scarcity or existential fear. He thought of the reports stamped "unlikely," of Hansi spiraling down in flames, of the Richlin engineers who knew the truth but were not heard, of the endless production lines in Farmingdale and Evansville that had built a new reality while his commanders clung to an old one. "I saw the future," Hartman said quietly, his eyes still on the circling thunderbolts. "And it was not ours." The numbers, when finally tallied after the guns fell silent, told the full, horrifying story of the Luftwaffe's destruction. From D-Day in June 1944 to the surrender in May 1945, the German fighter arm lost approximately 12,000 aircraft in combat with the Western Allies. The United States Army Air Forces lost 51 fighters in the European theater during the same period. The kill ratio had settled at around 2.3 to 1 in favor of the Americans, a figure that masked the utter totality of the German defeat, for it included the final, desperate months when the Luftwaffe was a hollow shell. Of the 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts built, 3,499 were lost to all causes worldwide. In air-to-air combat in Europe, the Thunderbolt achieved a kill ratio of 4.6 to 1 against German fighters. It had destroyed over 38 enemy aircraft in the air. But its true victory was not in dogfights. It was in making the skies safe for the bombers that broke the German war economy, and for the armies that marched to the heart of the Reich. The P-51 Mustang, arriving later, would claim even more kills, but it was the Thunderbolt that broke the back of the Luftwaffe in the critical spring and summer of 1944. The industrial comparison was the most crushing verdict. Between 1939 and 1945, Germany produced approximately 34,000 Bf-109s of all types and 20,000 Fw-190s, a total of 54,000 single-engine fighters. The United States in the same period produced 15,683 P-47s, 15,586 P-51s, and 12,275 P-40s and P-39s for all theaters, a total of over 43,500 modern single-engine fighters for the Army Air Forces alone, not including naval aircraft. In the pivotal year of 1944, when the air war was decided, German fighter production peaked at around 25,000 units for the entire year, across all types, many of them rushed, flawed designs. The United States produced over 22,000 fighters for the Army Air Forces in that same year. The difference was that American production was safe, efficient, and improving, while German production was under constant bombardment, starved of resources, and forced into catastrophic compromises. Years later, in a prisoner of war camp and later in his memoirs, General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland would articulate the defeat with poignant clarity. "We had fought the war as technicians and artists, valuing individual brilliance and mechanical perfection. The Americans fought it as engineers and production managers. They did not send us a better night. They sent us a perfectly standardized, mass-produced killing machine, operated by adequately trained pilots following a simple, effective playbook. And they sent it in numbers that drowned us. We looked at the P-47 and saw a clumsy barrel. We failed to understand that it was not a barrel, but a precisely engineered piston in the engine of a new kind of warfare. By the time we heard the engine roar, it was too late. The machine was already upon us." Erich Hartmann survived the war, spent 10 years in Soviet captivity, and eventually returned to a divided Germany. He never flew a fighter again. But on quiet evenings, he would sometimes look up at the sky, and in the distant drone of a modern jetliner, he would hear the faint, echoing memory of a different sound. The deep, ripping BRRRRRRRRAP of 850 caliber machine guns, and the silent, terrible revelation that came with it, that an era had ended not with a noble duel, but with the cold, efficient arrival of a new world, falling from a sunlit sky.